It is a wonderful honor today to introduce our wonderful speaker from this year's McSwain Walker Lecture. I'm Steve Hansen. I am the Vice Provost for International Affairs and Director of the Reeves Center for International Studies at William & Mary. And I'm going to give a little bit of a preliminary set of introductory points and then hand it over to our distinguished guest. First of all, I'd like to thank the sponsors of this event. In addition to the Reeves Center, we're very proud to partner with the William & Mary Law School's Center for Comparative Legal Studies and Post-Conflict Peacebuilding, led by the excellent Christy Warren. Also, William & Mary's Office of Compliance and Equity, and Carla Costello has been a wonderful supporter of this event. I want to thank in advance our great staff at the Reeves Center, Kate Hoving, who's done so much to put this together, Diane Alleman, Tyler Lawrence, and everyone else on the team. And I'd like also to thank June McSwain, our alumna and supporter who has made this series possible. The McSwain Walker Lecture Series brings renowned scholars, artists, analysts, and other notable public speakers to William & Mary to speak on topics related to how other countries and cultures interact with the United States and how the United States interacts with them. Previous speakers in this series include, for example, last year, Ambassador Karin Olofsdotter, who is the current ambassador of Sweden to the United States. And in its first year, the McSwain Walker Lecture was given by Harriet Mayer Fulbright. So it gives you a sense of the level of distinguished speakers that we've been fortunate to have. And none more so than today's fantastic speaker, Haben Girma. The first deafblind person to graduate from Harvard Law School, Haben advocates for equal opportunities for people with disabilities. President Barack Obama named her a White House Champion of Change, and she received the Helen Keller Achievement Award, a spot on the Forbes 30 Under 30 list. And President Bill Clinton, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, and Chancellor Angela Merkel have all honored her. Haben believes disability is an opportunity for innovation. She travels the world teaching the benefits of choosing inclusion. She's also the author of the highly acclaimed book, Haben, the Deafblind Woman Who Conquered Harvard Law, a testament to Haben's determination to resist isolation and find the keys to connection. I might add that Haben is a global figure. Her memoir was recently translated, for example, into Korean. And she was one of 3 disability rights activists who was recently asked by the New York Times to reflect on the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which we celebrate this year and in part with this wonderful lecture. Just a few housekeeping notes before I turn it over to Haben. First, a reminder that today's lecture is being live captioned, as you can see. If you do have a question, we would like you to submit it in the chat function of Zoom, and we will ask as many of these questions as we can in the time that we have. And a final note, we are recording today's lecture, so we'll email the link when it's ready, and we'll repeat that information at the end of the lecture. Without further ado, please join me in a warm William & Mary welcome for Haben Girma.
Thank you, Steve. Hello, everyone. My name is Haben Girma. As you heard, I'm deafblind. Deafblindness is a spectrum of vision and hearing loss. Deafblind people sometimes voice, sometimes sign, tactile sign, type. It's really important that we expand all the different ways people access information and communicate, which is one of the reasons why we're having captions for this talk, because it helps more people access the content. There's visual captions. There's also Braille captions, which is happening on my end. And I'm going to hold up the Braille computer I'm using. There are dots on the bottom, and I run my fingers over the dots. As Steve was talking, Gordon on my end was typing what Steve was saying, and I was reading it on the Braille computer. In about 15 minutes, We're going to do the first of 2 Q&As, and Steve will read out questions and comments from the chat feed. So as I'm talking, you can send in your questions and comments, and we'll get to it in about 15 minutes or so. People often ask me, if you're deaf, how are you speaking? Deafness is a spectrum, as I mentioned, lots of different kinds of hearing loss. My hearing loss is mostly in the low frequencies, so I learned to speak at a higher register. In some sexist communities, people, especially women with high frequency voices, are not respected, and that's not right. We need to create communities where all voices are valued, regardless of whether someone has a high frequency or low frequency voice, whether they have an accent, whether they sign or type, all voices should be respected. My name, Haben, comes from Eritrea, a small African country. Ethiopia is to the south, and to the north is the Red Sea. My mother grew up in Asmara, the capital of Eritrea, when there was a war between Ethiopia and Eritrea. When there's war, there's a lot of fear and violence and uncertainty. Schools were places for lucky students to come together and learn stories from around the world. Stories are powerful. Stories influence the organizations we design, the products we build, and the futures we imagine for ourselves. My mom, Saba, heard stories that America is the land of opportunities. America is the land of civil rights. And the stories inspired her to take the dangerous journey, walking from Eritrea to Sudan. It took about 3 weeks to do that walk. She was a refugee for about 10 months in Sudan, and then a refugee organization through the Catholic Church helped her come to the United States. Several years later, older, wiser, my mother realized it's not geography that creates justice. It's people who create justice. Communities create justice. All of us face the choice to tolerate oppression or advocate for justice. As the daughter of refugees, a Black woman, disabled, lots of stories say my life doesn't matter. I choose to resist those stories. I have to define for myself what it means to be a Black woman, what it means to be disabled, what it means to be American. When I was growing up, my parents heard stories from the Ethiopian and Eritrean communities. Oh, poor thing, she'll never grow up and get a job. She'll never go to school. We had to resist those stories and define for ourselves. The dominant narrative is disability is a burden on society. And consequently, there's a lot of shame, and a lot of people feel compelled to hide their disabilities. I choose to define disability as an opportunity for innovation. If you can't do something one way, that's an opportunity to come up with a new alternative way to do it. Alternative ways of accessing things are equal in value to mainstream ways of doing things. I'll give some examples. So you saw, I'm reading with Braille. I can't read with my eyes, but I can read with my fingers. And disabled people all over the world have come up with unique solutions because disability is an opportunity for innovation. More examples. Let's see the first video. I'm sharing a video that's actually from Mexico. Before the pandemic, when I would travel to meet with students all over the world, I traveled to ITSUN, Instituto Tecnológico de Sonora, and I met with the deaf community there and the students there. There was a young deaf man who also knew American Sign Language. And in the video, he and I are signing through American Sign Language. Each community, each deaf community has their own sign language. So in Mexico, there's a different sign language. In the US, the dominant one is American Sign Language. In France, it's French Sign Language. And across the pond in the UK, they have a completely different language. It makes no sense to me. They call it British Sign Language. Deaf communities are innovative. If you can't hear spoken language, you can create visual languages. And that's what deaf communities, deaf people have done. Deaf, blind people are also innovative. In the video, there's tactile sign language. I'm feeling through my hands. The man I'm signing with is sighted, so when I sign to him, I sign visually. But when I'm listening to him, I hold my hands over his hands to feel the signs. Tactile sign language. And deaf-blind people all over the world do different tactile sign languages depending on the local sign language. So lots of innovation all over the world. I'll give another example. Next video. In this video, I'm salsa dancing. I miss salsa dancing and other dances so much during the pandemic. I haven't gone dancing since February. Dancing, especially partner dances, are a way to express joy, to build communities, and get exercise. When I was growing up, I was taken out of physical education courses because instructors assumed I wouldn't be able to participate. Then one summer in middle school, I went to a camp for the blind. It was up in Napa, California. Some people go to Napa for wine, but I go there for camping. And at this camp, they had a blind dance instructor. And she taught me there are many different ways to connect through dance. Deaf people who can see the other dancers and see the beat. Blind people who can hear the music and respond and engage to the music. As a deaf-blind dancer, I couldn't hear the beat in the music. I couldn't see the other dancers, but I could feel the beat through the hands and shoulders of the people I'm dancing with. I've danced all over the world: Mexico, Spain, India, Dubai. The people I danced with, many of them did not speak English, but we could still communicate and understand each other through the shared language of salsa. Haptics is the communication of information through touch. As a blind person who chose to explore this, I've developed strong tactile intelligence. I'm really excited for more developments at the intersection of technology and haptics. And if we increase the diversity in our schools and our workplaces, we could have more people with tactile intelligence, which could help spark more innovation with touch-based communication and technologies. And I think during the pandemic, we've become even more aware of how important touch plays in our lives. There have been many barriers throughout my life, and I've been successful when people have chosen to do the work of removing barriers. These barrier removing people have made a huge difference. And one of my favorites was a high school teacher, and she approached me one day and asked, "Do you want to try surfing?" And I thought to myself, how would a blind person even surf? But I told her, yes, let's give it a try. She introduced me to an organization called Ride a Wave, and it's based in Santa Cruz, and they do tandem surfing. Next video. So we have a video with tandem surfing. It's a tandem is a large board, and so I'm surfing with a water guide on the back of the board, and I'm near the front of the board, and the water guide helps steer around other surfers and sharks. That's a joke. There weren't sharks in that ocean. Not at that part anyway. I really loved the experience of feeling the vibrations through my feet, through the surfboard, feeling the sun, the ocean, the wind. Tandem is when you do things with other people. Tandem surfing is beautiful, but I wondered, where are my limits exactly? Could I surf on my own? What would that look like? How would that work? So I started asking surf schools, can I go surfing? Can I take lessons? And they told me, we've never heard of a deafblind surfer. Then I found a surf school that said, we've never heard of a deafblind surfer, but let's try, let's find a way. So we had a lesson. Next video. In this video, I'm surfing on my own surfboard, and that gave me the opportunity to practice standing up and riding the wave on my own. And beside me is an instructor on his own surfboard, and because he's nearby, he could help steer around any potential sharks. So that was in Santa Cruz. Since then, I've gone surfing in Hawaii and other places in California. So many people associate disability with barriers. It's really an opportunity to come up with new ways of doing things. The instructors I worked with had to take the time to think about how to teach surfing through tactile communication. How do you know when to stand, how to balance, all those things in a non-visual way? And if a surfing instructor can do this, a math professor can do this, a music instructor, a science instructor. Every program at the school can be made accessible. It's really about taking the time to be thoughtful and creative and come up with solutions. So before I talk about my time at Harvard Law School, I want to pause and check in. Steve, how's everyone doing? Do we have any questions?
Haben, I have two questions already. Let me give you the first one, and it's not a shock to hear this one. People are wondering how the pandemic is affecting communities with disabilities around the world. And in particular, you've been talking about the importance of touch. So in this pandemic, we're told not to do it. I'm wondering a little bit, what's your reaction to getting through this pandemic, given the importance of touch?
So there's a lot of stigma around disabled people who rely on touch. For example, blind people. And I've heard of blind people in Ethiopia facing increased isolation because there's a lot of misinformation about the virus, of how it spreads, and fears about people who already face layers of stigma. And my advice is to, one, spread accurate, correct information and help people know what are the correct ways to stay safe. For example, when blind people need to touch and access something, you can be mindful to wash hands before and after the interaction. For example, tactile sign language. There are deaf, blind people who need to be able to touch just to have conversations and communicate. Be mindful to use hand sanitizer or wash your hands before and after each conversation. Wear a face mask. So rather than saying, oh, it's impossible, we can't do this, and allowing stigma to grow, pause and think about what are the things you actually can do and come up with safe solutions for making sure people have access, including people who need touch-based access.
Thank you, Haben. That's excellent advice. And there's a second question, which has to do with how disabilities are seen around the world. It is now the 30th anniversary of the ADA. And so people wonder, do you see changes in the relationship of different countries' leaders to their own population with disabilities? Is the ADA still pushing change on a global level? What are your impressions of the global context?
So there's more information now, and partly due to technology, more information about disability advocacy and civil rights is spreading around the world. And communities are asking ourselves, do we have to put up with oppression? How do we advocate for justice? How do we remove these barriers? Communities that don't have civil rights systems, or specifically a disability rights system, are thinking about creating new laws. For example, I traveled to Singapore last year and I met with the disability community there. They don't have a law equivalent to the ADA, but they're thinking about advocating for such a law so that disabled Singaporeans and disabled people who travel to Singapore can have full access. Each community has something they do really well and something that they struggle with. In Singapore, they didn't have a law for disability rights, but they had one of the most accessible metro systems, much more accessible compared to New York City or the San Francisco metro system. So each community has something to teach the United States, and disability advocates here have something to teach disabled communities around the world.
And maybe one last question for this round, and then we'll go back to the talk. We have a question from someone who wants to know.
Go for it.
Okay. Did you ever confront a gatekeeper in your career, someone who had access to things you wanted, who was not supportive? And how did you go about confronting that person? So it's a tough question. How do you kind of fight those kinds of people successfully?
That is an excellent question. So I'm going to continue with my presentation, and you will soon hear the perfect answer to that question. So back to the presentation, talking about gatekeepers and barriers. I went to college at Lewis and Clark in Portland, Oregon. Lewis and Clark made all my textbooks in Braille, so I had access to all my coursework. They worked with the outdoor club so I could participate in rock climbing and kayaking. There was just one barrier. At the cafeteria, there was a wall where they posted the menu, and sighted students could walk in, browse the menu, and go to their station of choice. I couldn't read the menu. I can read, but it needs to be in Braille or it needs to be in accessible computer format. So I went to the manager and I asked him, can you provide the menus in Braille or post them online or email it to me? I have assistive technology that allows me to use email and accessible websites. The manager said, "We're very busy. We have over 1,000 students. We don't have time to do special things for students with special needs." Just to be clear, eating is not a special need. Everyone needs to eat. There's an assumption that there are two kinds of people, disabled and non-disabled, independent and dependent. But everyone has a time in their life when they depend on other people. A lot of you like drinking coffee. Very few of you grow your own coffee beans. You depend on other people to help you with your food, your computers. Everyone has situational times when they depend on other people. And that's okay, as long as we're honest about the fact that we're all interdependent. The manager did not understand this. I was a vegetarian back then, and it was really hard to eat vegetarian when I didn't have access to food information. There were about 6 different stations. I would go to the station at random, wait in line for 20 minutes, get food, find a table, try the food, and discover an unpleasant surprise. It was really frustrating. I told myself, maybe I should just be grateful. At least I have food. Lots of people around the world struggle for food. Who was I to complain? My mother, when she was my age, was a refugee in Sudan. Who was I to complain? Maybe this was just preparation for life as a disabled person. Maybe I should just get used to inferior services. I talked to friends and they reminded me it's my choice. It's our choice to accept unfairness or advocate for justice. I did research. Then I went back to the cafeteria manager and explained, the Americans with Disabilities Act prohibits discrimination against students with disabilities. If you don't provide access to the menu, I'm going to take legal action. I had no idea how I would do that. I was just 19. I couldn't afford a lawyer. Now I know there are nonprofit legal centers that support students with disabilities. But back then I didn't know that. All I knew is I had to try. I had to do something. The next day, the manager apologized and promised to make the menus accessible. They started emailing the menus, and I could use my accessible computer to read the menus and then go to my station of choice. I had a white cane and I had the orientation skills to navigate the cafeteria on my own. So if I read the menu and it says station 4, tortellini cheese tortellini, then I have the ability to use my white cane, navigate over to station 4, get my food, find the table, and eat a delicious meal. So when the barrier was finally removed, life became delicious. The next year, a new blind student came to the college, and he had immediate access to the menus. That taught me when I advocate, it helps all the students who come after me. There are many barriers in our communities, barriers impacting women, disabled people, people of color. If we do the work of removing a small barrier, we build up the skills to master the larger obstacles. This experience inspired me to go to law school. In 2010, I was Harvard Law's first deafblind student. Harvard told me, "We've never had a deafblind student before. And I told them I have never been to Harvard Law School before. We didn't know what all the challenges would be or what all the solutions would be, but we engaged in an interactive process for each assignment, for each barrier, for each internship. And in 2013, I graduated. Photo, please. We have a photo from graduation. Dean Minnow is handing me my diploma. Dean Minnow and I are wearing academic regalia, and my guide dog is wearing a fancy fur coat. What I did is called image description. Image description provides access for blind individuals. When you post photos online, social media, add image descriptions so that blind individuals can participate in these conversations. And when you're posting on Twitter, there's a feature that allows you to add image descriptions so it doesn't impact your character account. Lots of conversations are happening online right now, so please do add image descriptions, and for videos, add captions. Back to Harvard. Harvard was not always inclusive. Helen Keller, who was born in 1880, she really wanted to go to Harvard, but back then Harvard only admitted men. Helen's disability didn't hold her back. Her gender didn't hold her back. It was the community at Harvard that excluded all women. Over time, that community changed and opened its doors to women, people of color, and people with disabilities. So people sometimes say to me, you overcame your disabilities to graduate from Harvard Law School. I did not overcome my disabilities. I'm still disabled. I'm still deafblind. It was Harvard that overcame some of its ableism. Ableism is the assumption that disabled people are inferior. We need to do the work of removing ableism from our schools and communities so that disabled people have equal opportunities. Many of you know about sexism and racism. Ableism is another word you should know about. Discrimination against disabled people is widespread and hidden. Very few people know about it. So we need to help people identify it and do the work of removing it. Sometimes when you ask someone to remove a barrier, they come up with ridiculous reasons not to do it. I'm going to share some arguments you can use to convince these people to choose inclusion. Next slide. So on screen are some arguments you can use, and I'm going to go through it. The first one is reach. You reach more people when you choose inclusion. There are over 1 billion disabled people around the world. And in the US, over 61 million Americans with disabilities. So when you choose inclusion, you reach more students, their families, professors. More talented people are able to join your team if you remove barriers. For digital content, you increase content discoverability when it's accessible. I'll give some examples. When you add image descriptions to digital content and captions and transcripts to videos, you increase the text associated with your content, which means search engine optimization. More people will find your content, whether disabled or non-disabled. This is also known as the curve cut effect. The curve cut effect came out of the city of Berkeley. Berkeley was one of the first places to add curb cuts. Those are the ramps, the small ramps at the end of the sidewalk, going from the sidewalk to the street. And it allowed wheelchair users to navigate the city of Berkeley independently. Once the city installed these curb cuts, parents pushing strollers started using them. Travelers with luggage started using them. Kids with ski boards loved them. When you add a disability accessibility feature to a community, it usually benefits the entire community, and non-disabled people find new ways and new benefits for this accessibility feature. We see this happening all the time, the curb cut effect. It happens with digital content too. Captions benefit deaf people, but they also benefit hearing people in many different situations, such as when audio isn't working or someone's battling Zoom fatigue, and it helps process information when you can see the words and hear the words. The curb cut effect. The third argument you can use is disability drives innovation. There are many stories throughout our history of disability sparking new technology. Many of these stories are hidden, so we need to get the word out there so more people know disability drives innovation. Here's an example. Vint Cerf is one of the fathers of the internet. He is deaf, hard of hearing, and before the internet existed as we know it today, deaf people struggled to communicate long distance. We didn't have access to telephones. Vint Cerf developed one of the earliest email protocols. Through email, deaf people could communicate without straining to hear over the phone. Guess who else likes using email? Hearing people. Lots of hearing people use email. If you design for a disability challenge, you could end up building the next big thing, like email. Again, that's just one of many, many different examples. I'll offer one more example. We'll go further back in history to 1808. There were two friends in Italy, one sighted, one blind. These two friends wanted to be able to send letters to each other. This was back before email, back before even Braille. And if a blind person wanted to write a letter, they had to dictate it and someone else would write it down for them. These two friends couldn't do that. Their letters had to stay secret. They were love letters. They used this as a design challenge. How can we create a way to write that doesn't require sight? They built one of the earliest working typewriters. Through a typewriter, you can memorize the layout. You can memorize the layout of the keys and type through touch. Nowadays, some of the fastest typists are touch typists, and lots of people write letters through keyboards. Disability drives innovation. Love also drives innovation. So if you encounter someone who doesn't think accessibility matters, you can share these arguments. Tell them they'll reach more people, over 1 billion people around the world with disabilities. They'll increase content discoverability. They'll drive innovation. If the stubborn, difficult person is still not convinced, tell them about legal requirements. The Americans with Disabilities Act requires places of public accommodation and schools and digital services. Virtual businesses, for example, must make their services accessible and are prohibited from discrimination against people with disabilities. Litigation is expensive and time-consuming. It's much, much easier to choose inclusion rather than dealing with lawyers. I've talked quite a bit about digital accessibility, I'm going to share a short video that shows what that looks like. So when I'm using my phone, I use VoiceOver. VoiceOver can speak out loud and send information to the digital braille display.
News. Checking for news. National Geographic. Unread. World's largest rodents on lam from Toronto Zoo.
I'm panning right on the braille display using the advanced forward button. If I wanted to instead use hand gestures on the iPhone, I could flick right with one finger. To open an item, I can double tap anywhere on the screen.
Text size. Caption. Title. Title. World's large. Title. After escaping from the High Park Zoo in Canada, 2 capybaras have eluded capture by Jason Biddle. Published June 9. Most people do their best to avoid rodents of unusual size. But after a pair of capybaras escaped from Toronto's High Park Zoo on May alert. Gordon. Hi, I'm at the door. Sushi. Pot of food. Fish cake with swirl design.
My friend's at the door, so I'm just gonna let him know.
Close. Button. Reply. Button. Messages notification. Hang. In. There. I'm almost done with this demo. Send. Button.
VoiceOver has allowed me to access more information, news, mail, and messages, and it's also a way for me to know when friends are at the door. Welcome back. So the voice in the video is the screen reader, and that's on multiple different platforms, Windows, Android. There are guidelines for how to make websites and apps accessible. For websites, it's the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. For apps, Android Accessibility Guidelines or iOS Accessibility Guidelines. So encourage tech developers, your computer science department, to teach about accessibility guidelines. Some people think, oh, we'll just make a second website for disabled people or a separate app for disabled people. Separate is never equal. You might start out with good intentions, but down the line, the app for disabled people gets fewer updates and fewer resources, and that's not fair. So what we want is for one website, one app, one school that's accessible to everyone. Other accessibility features to keep in mind is captioning. Make sure videos have captions. Support for assistive devices like the Braille computer that I use. This is just one of maybe 100 different Braille computers. Some are smaller, some are larger. These are some of the things that exist. Keep innovating. Schools are fantastic places for students and professors to come up with new ideas to share information. As you develop new things, don't make assumptions about what disabled people can and can't do. Design for everything to be inclusive. Several years ago, I went to China for the first time. It was a long flight to Beijing. When I arrived, I went straight to my hotel room to take a nap. But then I discovered something strange. I picked it up, was holding it in my hand, trying to figure out what it was. It almost felt like a piece of fruit. I asked myself, should I taste it? I was really curious to figure out what it was, but not curious enough to bite into an unknown object. So instead, I took a picture with my phone and texted it to a friend asking, what is this? Is it safe to eat? Next slide. We have a photo of dragon fruit. and I learned I like dragon fruit. Now there's some people who would think, don't bother making a camera app accessible. Blind people would never take photos. Don't make assumptions. Design for every aspect of the school to be fully accessible. The lighting program, the theater program, outdoor activities should be as accessible as possible. And if you don't know how, that's okay. When I went to Harvard Law School, they had no idea how to support a deafblind student. Engage in an interactive process. Be creative. Be innovative, and you'll come up with solutions. Next photo. We have a photo with President Obama. He is standing on the other side of a table from me, typing on a keyboard, and I'm reading from a Braille computer. And behind us, Valerie Jarrett and Vice President Joe Biden are watching in the photo. This is from the 25th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. I met President Obama at the White House, and he usually communicates by voice. I explained that I access information best through Braille. He graciously switched from voicing to typing so I can access his words. Inclusion is a choice. When you choose inclusion, you role model it for everyone around you. Our bodies are always changing. We deserve dignity and access at every stage in our lives. Next slide. I wrote a book called Haben, the Deaf-Blind Woman Who Conquered Harvard Law. To remind people, I did not conquer my disability. I'm still deaf-blind and disabled. It was ableism that Harvard needed to conquer and overcome. I hope more people learn this word, ableism, and can join me in the movement of removing barriers and making our communities more inclusive around the world. And I'm going to open it up and check in with Steve. Let's hear from student questions.
Fantastic, Haben. We've got quite a number of questions, so I will go quickly. The first one, we're co-sponsoring this talk with the William & Mary Law School. So we have a question from someone who wonders how bar exams are doing in accommodating people with disabilities. Is that something that goes pretty well these days, or are there problems?
Great question. I took the bar exam in 2013. Several years before that, a blind law student sued the bar examiners because of barriers for blind students. And due to that litigation in that case, many barriers were removed. Not all of them, but many barriers were removed. So by the time it was my turn to take the bar exam, I asked, can I get the exam in Braille? And they said yes. They'd learned their lesson. But there's still more barriers that need to be removed in the bar exam. And right now, because of the pandemic, we've so many disabled law students have been struggling. So that's another thing to keep in mind. But good question.
Another question which has a legal element comes from a listener who says, how do you handle disclosure of disabilities in job applications? So there seems to be a danger if you disclose early, maybe someone would actually not promote you for the job. But if you don't disclose and then it comes up later in the process, like a kind of in-person interview, then they may not be ready for the disability. So what's your advice?
That's an extremely personal choice. I've been on both sides of that. So when I started back in college, my resume did not say that I was disabled, but there were lots of disability references. For example, I said I was a Braille tutor, and I was not getting much feedback. So then I revised my resume and I changed Braille tutor to reading tutor, which is really the same job. Braille is reading and writing. And I got more requests for interviews. And then they would meet me at the interview and realize I was disabled and come up with all kinds of excuses of why the job was no longer available. It was incredibly frustrating. Employment discrimination is a huge problem. There are lots of incredibly talented disabled people who have so much to offer all these organizations, but are just being discriminated against. And the organizations are losing out on talented people. So my advice is do what works best for you. Ultimately, you want an employer who will respect you and be inclusive. And I think the most common strategy I've seen is to minimize disclosing until the interview. And then at the interview, you could answer and explain as much or as little as they want. And that helps address stereotypes and situations where employers might be too afraid to ask beforehand, but in your presence or on the call might be able to get their questions answered. So that's probably one of the most common strategies I've seen.
Thank you, Haben. Would you have time for 2 more questions?
Yes, go for it.
Great. I know we're just a little over the time. So I'm going to group one question, which is sort of several people. It has to do with the latest technologies to create accessibility for people with disabilities. So we have a question about conferences. You know, people feel they don't know how to plan a conference in a way that would feel particularly welcoming necessarily for people with disabilities. Also, one person is curious if you know this app called Be My Eyes and what you think of it. And finally, one person is interested in children and if there are good technologies for education of young children who may be deafblind or have other disabilities where technology could be a solution.
So many great questions. The app called Be My Eyes is a free service where sighted people can volunteer to describe photos and videos for blind individuals. So a blind person is at home and wants to figure out what they received in the mail, they could take a picture of it or do a video chat with a volunteer who would read it and describe it for them. That's the Be My Eyes app. It's all over the world. People who are in areas that have limited data service unfortunately don't have full access to it. And I'm hopeful internet service and cell service will increase around the world so that more disabled people can gain access to these free tools like Be My Eyes and other services. Similar for deaf-blind technology and all disabled technology, the tools exist, but they're difficult to gain access to in a lot of developing countries due to money or infrastructure. So we need to help spread access to these services, and we also need to increase research to make services accessible. Computer Braille is really expensive right now. We want scientists to devote time and resources to creating new, affordable computer braille. That is the holy braille. And hope that would increase access to literacy for blind people in many developing countries.
So thank you again, Haben. The very last question then, so we don't hold you, is from a listener who's from Eritrea. And she's wondering if you have some comments on the situation in that country today and any particular sort of experiences you'd like to convey.
Eritrean culture and community and food is a big part of my life. I really don't like cooking, but during the pandemic, like many people, I've spent more time in the kitchen than I usually do, and I've been working on some Eritrean dishes, which is incredibly delicious. And there are disability advocates in Eritrea, but due to limited tech and infrastructure, it's hard to get tools, tech, and information to the disability community there. And I continue to work with advocates to try to increase opportunities. Great questions, though. This was really wonderful to be able to talk with the William and Mary community, and I'm hopeful one day I can visit in person.
Haben, I know I speak for everyone in saying we would love to have you come to Williamsburg whenever this pandemic is over. And much of the chat, when people were having a chance to ask questions, was just filled with gratitude to you. So many people were writing how much they appreciate all of your time with us, your advice, your insights, and it really touched a lot of people, including me. So thank you from me as well, and everyone I know will join me with a huge round of applause. It's virtual in the chat.
Thank you, everyone. I appreciate that. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and let's keep in touch.